experience and expression across a variety of media, from Yiddish and Russian film and literature of the early Soviet period to contemporary works. His published work includes articles on Russian Jewish writers David Bergelson and Isaac Babel, as well as that aforementioned critical introduction and notes to the English language translation of Kulbach's Yiddish novel, The Zalmanyaners. He has also published on contemporary English language fiction by Russian Jewish emigre authors in the United States, including Gary Steingart, Anya Ulinich, Boris Fishman, and Irina Rain. In addition to his academic work, Professor Senderovich has published journalism and public-facing scholarship in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Lilith, The Forward, The New York Times, and The New Republic, The New Yorker's page-turner blog, Jewish Currents, and Seattle's The Stranger. He is also an engaged educator. One of his additional regular activities involves summertime teaching as a faculty member of the Great Jewish Books program for high school students in Amherst, Massachusetts. Because he is engaged with Russian, Yiddish, and English language creative output of Jews in and after the Soviet Union, Senderovich is uniquely capable of navigating the linguistic and cultural arenas in which his subjects find expression. And Senderovich inhabits and even recreates those worlds in his capacity as a translator. Together with Harriet Murav, he translated Judgment by David Bergelson, a novel that traces the death of the shtetl and the beginning of the new post-revolutionary world. Currently, he and Harriet Murav are working on another translation project called In the Shadow of the Holocaust, short fiction by Jewish writers from the Soviet Union. This project has been awarded the National Endowment for the Humanities grant, and the expected book, which will be a collection of works by 7 different authors, some of whom wrote in Yiddish and others in Russian, is under advance contract with Stanford University Press. Senderovich does more than translate the words of texts, of course. He captures the contours of the worlds they express, and this is equally the case in his scholarship, especially in his new book, How the Soviet Jew Was Made, published by Harvard University Press in 2022. We have spoken already about how Senderovich's work on the Soviet person considers from multiple angles how this figure takes shape. But here I would like to trouble this idea and stress that perhaps his work is much more about how this figure does not take shape. Where other scholars have emphasized ideology or economy as the principal factors in the formation of the Soviet Jew, Senderovich's voice is a vital one because he looks to divergences between the idealized, the realized, and expressions of each. Where other scholars have drawn ideological lines in the sand and attempted to corral the figure of the Soviet Jew squarely in the communist camp, commit them to capitalism, or emphasize their embrace of a kind of romanticized nationalism, Senderovich does not try and define Soviet Jewishness as or against any one thing. Rather, he goes against the grain to embrace the multiplicity and dynamism of the Soviet Jew. The strength of his scholarship lies, I believe, not only in how thoughtfully he attends to his topic, but also in his capacity to convey multiplicity. He draws upon a diverse cast of characters and categories in his research, and it is through this multifaceted prism that any rigid semblance of what is strictly Soviet or strictly Jewish breaks down. He shows how the Soviet Jewish person was trying at once to make sense of their new reality and their relationship to the old. Consequently, his book is a study of very human experiences and therefore a relevant and important text beyond just Soviet and Jewish studies. How the Soviet Jew Was Made was named as a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award in January of 2023. And this vital work of scholarship and the urgent question embedded in its title have brought us here today. It is my honor now to give the floor to the insightful scholar behind it all. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Professor Sasha Senderovich.
Thank you so much to Elaine Wilson for this very generous introduction. I don't think I'm very new at this whole thing of being called a senior scholar, so I have not experienced this kind of introduction before. So I'm still processing this, but and of course also to Noah, Sasha to both of them for organizing this conference, and to the Deutsches Haus for welcoming us, and to the Harriman Institute, and to the Center for Jewish and Muslim Studies. It's also great to speak here. This is my second time speaking at Columbia. Jeremy Dauber invited me 7 years ago or so. And it was a talk on Isaac Babel, which became one of the chapters in the book. I'm not going to reprise that. But I've also built on the work of Rebecca Coburn. The Bialystok book was very important to my understanding of a kind of a diaspora that leaves a shtetl and goes somewhere else. And of course, also I'm indebted to work of Gennady Astra, who spoke earlier today, who is the maven of everything that has to do with Soviet Jews. And also Elisa Ben-Porat, who is no longer here, but left to teach, but also was speaking earlier today, whose work on the Civil War and the pogroms of the Civil War is really crucial and made it possible for me to write the first chapter of the book, which I wrote last. I couldn't have done it without The Legacy of Blood. So it's just really great to be, and of course, I learned lots of things today from a half dozen graduate students. So as far as I can, I'll acknowledge various things that are new to me in my talk. And this talk is kind of a weird thing, because most of the audience here and also online are here for a book talk. They haven't read the book. Some people in this audience have read the book. So I want to try to do both things, to talk about the book to people who haven't read the book, but also say something new to people who have. So I don't know if I'll be able to please both parties or just please everyone, but we'll see how this goes. So I'll add I'll say various things about methodology and things like that that are kind of very scholarly, kind of interesting to those of us who work on this, but there'll be things for the general public too. The not judging the book by its cover, when my press was looking at possibilities for a cover, it seems like they first tried to push me into this, which when you publish a book on the Soviet period, especially the 1930s and the 1920s, red seems to be the important color, and red and black is usually the preferred color scheme for such books. Those of you who are familiar with the field will recognize numerous such covers that seem to follow that pattern very closely. So instead, I was able to negotiate down to this thing is somehow not. No, it works. It's just not. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay. We were able to negotiate to kind of a little bit of red coloring this black and white picture, which now gives it a distinct Schindler's List feel, which is also not what I was going for. But that's kind of enough about that. But I do want to talk about the image. And it's not the image that I knew about. It's the image that the editors found, but I really like it and actually kind of grew on me. They've rejected everything that I suggested. And we don't know where this comes from, except for what we see in the picture, right? So we're looking at some kind of a tailors, hat makers, artel, some kind of cooperative of hat makers. It's probably the early 1920s. They're in Skvira in Ukraine. Right, because we can see that behind them in Ukrainian. They represent some kind of a help organization, like a aid organization in Skvira, Ukraine. And the Yiddish poster behind them is also partially obscure, but there's something about Rattenverband and probably Arbeiter class, kind of this sort of ideological slogans. I'm sure Gennady knows exactly what it is that we're looking for, but I don't know, right? So there's all partially obscured. But from what we can tell, I'm kind of interested in the way that they're portrayed, and they're people with tools of their trades, kind of at the very beginning of the Soviet period, and we have a little bit of Lenin. There is a very slightly visible portrait of Lenin above them. So it's kind of subtle Soviet, not over your head Soviet. The story begins for me. Let's see if I can do this. Sorry, one more. Sorry about this. One more. Yep, there we go. This one. Is that okay? All right. So I kind of began to. think about how to frame this book after I had been working on this for some time and didn't quite understand what the framing was. But suddenly rereading Isaac Babel, the writer for whom I hold a lot of affection, suddenly it struck me that the kind of beginning of the story that I'm telling begins in a story of his from the 1920s that is set in 1919 in Odessa. It's called Конец богадельни, the end of the almshouse, the end of the poorhouse. And the story is about old people, elderly Jews, who live at a poorhouse, communally supported poorhouse at a cemetery in Odessa. And you think that stories about cemeteries are stories about things that end, right? Because cemetery is the end of things. But this is a story about something that begins. And that's really odd because these elderly people are expelled from their poorhouse near the cemetery by Bolsheviks, including Jewish Bolsheviks. And the end of the story is this image. This is the very final words of the story. The heat tormented the heap of rags that was dragging itself across the earth. Their road lay along a joyless, scorched and stony highway, past waterland daub shanties, past fields choked with stones, past bombed out houses, past the plague hill. Once upon a time in Odessa, this inexpressibly melancholy road had led from the town to the cemetery. So I was struck by this. What does it mean to begin a story of the Soviet period with the image of people cast out of a cemetery? Right, place where they were supposed to end, right, but then somehow go on living. This is 1919, the very beginning of the Soviet period, and these people go, we don't know where, right, because the story leaves them on the road. So they have destinations, but we don't know where the destinations are. So I came to understand Babel's heap of rags, right, because they become sort of equated to the clothes that they wear. I came to understand it not as a pejorative term, but as a shorthand for a collection of habits, practices, and cultural tropes associated with the defunct Russian Empire's Ashkenazi Jews. They were appended by the revolution, but did not remain behind and die off in the old world. Instead, personal characteristics, worn-out possessions, disaggregated bits of culture, and uprooted customs carried on across the landscape of the Soviet experience. Along the way, these bits of culture encountered and were modified by new ideological messages and structural pressures, and the Soviet Jew, the layered, indeterminate, and fluid figure that emerged from this alchemy, remained in perpetual motion. So in my book, I try to outline the contours of this emergent figure. So I wanted to talk about kind of methodological approaches and the way that I try to get into these questions. Now, if I could have the next slide. One thing that's really key for me is the time frame. I began in 1917, and the book ends in the second half of the 1930s, and there are many reasons to do that. So Elaine Wilson's dissertation refers to this as the exotic period, the period of kind of exodus from the Pale, right? And also ending around 1935, which is the year when we could think about the kind of concretization of Soviet culture, of rigidification of Soviet ideology. So it's the period when things are more or less open and fluid and can kind of go in multiple ways as people find their new footing. The way that I think about this has to do with a map. So this is a map that a map maker made for my book. And what the map maker tried to do through our conversations is to try to represent time and space in this sort of two-dimensional frame. So what you see is the map of the Soviet Union and Europe after 1922, so after the end of the First World War and the creation of the USSR in 1922. And shaded in darker color is the territory of the former Pale of Settlement, which had ceased existing in February of 1917, right? So the Pale of Settlement is no longer on the map of post-1917 Russian and Soviet Union, but I wanted to try to trace the outlines of this place from which people, right, the heap of rags, become expelled into the Soviet experience, and try to think about this lingering presence of the Pale in the cultural landscape of the Soviet Union. And when you do that, things become sort of interesting. Could you click it once and then twice? Oh, no. Yep, there we go. We need this line, right? The yellow line is the division between what becomes part of the Soviet Union, right? And what's now part of Poland, the independent state of Poland, but also Romania, right? Lithuania, Latvia, the sort of post-World War I states. So the kind of contiguous cultural, I mean, it's not really contiguous because there's a diversity there, but it's part of one political entity with where, most Jews live, becomes now separated into different countries. And that creates a possibility for kind of all sorts of things to happen differently. I think about the map as related to the time period because this map is made possible by the revolution of 1917, but this map also changes yet again in the late 1930s with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, right, when this line is redrawn again. So I'm thinking about the period of my book as being bracketed by this sort of openness, not openness, but the sort of reconfiguration of the map before it changes again, and a different story needs to be told. Something else that has to do with the time frame that's also really important for me is to think about kind of histories of violence as something that frames this period. So on the one hand, 1917 and the beginning of the kind of long period of violence that people refer to as the Russian Civil War, that is very fundamental to Jews in the former Russian Empire. And then, of course, as we get into 1939, right, the beginnings of the Holocaust. And then something else that's also really not trivial to me, and this has to do with the way in which American Jews understand Soviet Jews or misunderstand Soviet Jews. This book is not about that, but I try to think about the framing with an eye to that, because to many readers, Jewish readers in America, Soviet Jew means a certain thing that has to do with being persecuted in the Soviet Union in the late Soviet period. And often this persecution gets expressed, the way that people remember this period, through the Soviet passport, that the Soviet passport had a nationality written in it, and it said Jewish, and therefore Jews were persecuted. So importantly for my time frame, the internal passport wasn't introduced until 1932. And its introduction had nothing to do with nationality at that point or ethnicity. It had to do with giving people, kind of tethering them to a place so that they could reside in cities. And it was to exclude peasants in Ukraine, especially, who were being dragged into the collective farms from being able to leave the collective farms and settle in cities. You needed an internal passport to be able to do that. The nationality line or ethnicity line is already there, but it's not really emphasized or really enforced until the late 30s, when the NKVD begins to be concerned with Polish spies and the kind of the fear of aggression from Poland. So they begin to first really track that, then Germans, and only in the later Soviet period does the Jewish nationality line become a subject of the way that people think about Jews. So to me, this is also a period when Soviet Jewish is open, right? And it's more open, and it's not sort of has formal or kind of legal associations that an internal document would have at a later period, right? So that's why it's important for me to think about this time frame first. Another point that's really important for me to think about when I think about this book is languages, and to think about how the material that I try to work with is about half Yiddish and Russian. And Yiddish I think of as a language of native to most Jews living at that time, born in the Russian Empire, kind of moving into the Soviet period. And I think of Russian in this case as a state language of the Soviet state. There are also other ways to try to tell the story. So other people have begun to try to do that. When you think about skipping Russian, right? So Yohanan Petrovsky-Stern has a book about Ukrainian as a language in which Jews in Ukraine engage with the Ukrainian national project, skipping over this kind of imperial Russian language. But I'm trying to think about the Soviet Union as this kind of imperial presence that exerts its influence, and therefore it's Russian and Yiddish. And I try to think of things in this book that are not just Russian and Yiddish, but also somehow Russian and Yiddish at the same time. The texts that are in Russian have one ear towards Yiddish, texts that are in Yiddish are either circulating in Russian translation, or the writers who write them know Russian and engage with Russian language literature. So it's important for me to think about this at the same time. And that brings me to kind of thinking about translation, which Elaine mentioned in her introduction. And it's such a delight to hear how I forgot about that email, but that you came to the work of Kullback also through the English translation is wonderful to think about the importance of translation and the way that people can find out about this literature. But also translation is important to me both as a practice. Two of the chapters I write about are novels I either translated or edited. So you get to kind of live inside them and know these texts really well. So I recommend it to people who want to do that. But also as an approach, right? You're kind of always thinking about between languages. And that I think is really key to the period. And then kind of one other point to make about what I do is to think about context and thinking about different ways of kind of telling kind of cultural history with literary sources. I'm a scholar of literature, some cinematic sources. I'm not an historian, but I read historians and engage with historians' work and learn from historians. And I try to think about how to write something like a cultural history that's kind of really informed by literary texts. So to me, kind of the importance of doing that is to think about different kinds of documents that are available publicly at the time. So I write about literature that was published. Right? That's a decision that I make. It means that I'm not writing about things that also existed but weren't published. And this becomes more of an issue as we move into the post-war period. One of the presentations with her today was about samizdat, right? Something that doesn't get officially published and circulates, but in a much narrower circles. I'm interested in officially published literature, in part also because it elicits public discussion that's also published in press. So it's interesting for me and important for me to gravitate towards works that have left this trail in the kind of available public record in which we can establish something like a discourse, something like a context about how people engaged with those works and how they thought about their role in the moment at the time. So let me I want to make a couple of examples of this kind of contextual approach. Next slide, if you don't mind. So one of the protagonists of my book, Moshe Kullback, who writes the novel that Elaine mentioned, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later, is also a translator. And he translated Gogol into Yiddish. And this, I tell the story in my book, he was assigned a very kind of dirty task of editing and publishing with his name attached a translation of an important Soviet novel, How the Steel Was Tempered, by Nikolai Ostrovsky, and the translation that was done by someone who by then had been arrested as a Trotskyist. Right, so the translator's name is removed from the publication and it has his name attached in 1936, but he also is part of a broader context of Belarusian literature. He's in Minsk and he attends the 1934 Congress in Moscow, in which socialist realism was proclaimed the reigning ideology of Soviet literature, and he attends it as part of the Belarusian delegation. Right, so when he comes back to Minsk, he writes in Russian, in Minsk press, about going to that conference and the importance of translating the literature of ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union in different languages. So contextually, right, I'm trying to think about a figure who writes a novel in Yiddish, who is also has his fingers, right, all over the place in the kind of broader literary sphere, and how that can inform the way that we can think about the importance of these works. Another kind of really important moment for me is serialization, publications that are published, novels that are published serially in several issues of a journal or sometimes different journals, because when we look at serialization history, we can try to establish what else was read by people who read that journal. So what other discussions they were privy to as they were reading a work of fiction. That's really key. And also there's a kind of global context to this kind of sense of the emergence of the figure of the Soviet Jew that isn't just in the Soviet Union, because some of the material circulates abroad. So in Yiddish especially, right, the things that I write about that were written in Yiddish were sometimes published outside the Soviet Union, and definitely available even in Soviet publications to readers outside the Soviet Union. So you can find the reviews in Polish press, right, or in American press, but also in Russian, oddly. So if you don't mind the next slide, this is the United lecture about Azerbaijan that we heard in the previous session. Victor Fink, one of the Russian journalists who wrote about the region, had published a book in 1930 that I write about, kind of reporting on his expedition to the Jewish Autonomous Region. It was not yet called the Jewish Autonomous Region, then to Azerbaijan in the Far East. And he had a piece of it translated into English and published in Menorah Journal, right, this kind of American Jewish intellectual journal. In the section, and I gave you a sense of from other issues of this journal, what that section published, right? Letters from abroad, right? There were these sort of, the article about Tel Aviv is by Chaim Arlozorov. I kind of had to cut out the names, but it's also really interesting to kind of see this. So it gets published in this context in 1931, and then Fink republishes his book in 1932, in which he addresses in the preface the smackdown that he's received for his negative portrayal of Azerbaijan because the word got out in the West, right? And he clearly has to publish some kind of second edition where he cleans up his, not finding anything kind of value in Azerbaijan in 1930. And we can trace this, right, to this kind of global context of why that happens. That's really important. So serialization is really important to me to kind of establish access to a kind of cultural history over the time. And to kind of conclude this bit on context and serialization, I'll kind of give you an example about how to kind of think about working with serial publications. And this is something to which I'm indebted to my Slavic advisors, my Russian literature advisors, like Bill Todd, in kind of thinking through, who are really 19th century scholars of Russian literature, in thinking about how most of the works that we came to know as Russian literary classics are serialized works, right? Anna Karenina, Brothers Karamazov, right? So there's an importance to reading them in context, in which that context influences what goes into those novels, most famously about Anna Karenina, about which Leanna Hamill spoke earlier. Tolstoy publishes it from 1873 until 1877, right? And between those two dates, a war begins, right, with Turkey. So at the final part of Anna Karenina, Vronsky is dispatched to the war that Tolstoy couldn't have possibly planned for from the beginning. So the way that the serialized literature responds directly to the political context. So David Bergelsen, in his novel Midas Hadin Judgment, he began to serialize it in 1926 in the journal that he himself edited in Berlin. Only 2 issues of this journal came out in Span. And in the same journal, so his novel is in red, in the red box in the table of contents. In the blue table of contents, under his initials, David Bergelsen, is his very famous article, Drei Zentren, 3 centers, in which he begins to articulate the importance of the Soviet Union, of Moscow as a destination for Yiddish literature. He chooses it over Poland and America. And people who have kind of read that essay, some scholars have read it as a kind of programmatic, I'm going to move back to the Soviet Union. He doesn't for another 6 years, 7 years, 8 years. And it's important to kind of think about that novel that he publishes in the same context that is published side by side with this essay, because the novel in some ways could be seen as his attempt to write a Soviet novel. Next slide. So they just appear side by side in the same issue. And then he, if you don't mind, Noah, in his essay, he writes about imagining, in the essay, Drei Zentren, he writes about imagining the Soviet Union in which a different kind of Soviet worker will emerge. And then the next slide, right, that Certainly the new Jewish artist, so he himself imagining a move to the Soviet Union, will have to see destruction around him, unavoidable destruction crying to the heavens, the full severity of the law, Midas Hadin, which is the title of the novel he also writes in the same journal, the road of social justice, poverty, need, etc. So he articulates some kind of a political vision, which is then also the title of the novel, which itself is very complicated. So to kind of summarize something about this kind of approach is to really think about how, to me, I gravitate towards published books that also existed in serialized form, right? Which also limits me in what I write about, but it's deliberate. I'm kind of trying to put constraints on myself to try to trace kind of this multitude of contexts, which leaves the room open for many other kinds of approaches to for other people to write about. What do I have on the next slide? Okay, so we can skip. This is all more Midas Hadin. Yes, so this is the publication of one of the installments in a different journal of the same novel. Bergelsen published it all over the place. And this announces that the book will be published in book form the coming year in Kulturlige in Kiev. So let me kind of give a very brief kind of sense of what kinds of questions I ask in the book about what a Soviet Jew might be as the Soviet Jew emerges. And I'll do it by way of kind of thinking about like the way that I thought about the structure of my book is I'm not a, painter, but if I were like learning how to paint, I would maybe like, and I didn't have a kind of an idea of the whole picture from the beginning. Maybe I'll paint a little in one corner, a little in the other corner. I have no idea if I'm making the right analogy here. A little bit somewhere else. And then like, voila, there's like something that you can connect, right? So, so I try to think of kind of 5 questions or 5 moments that I ask, questions that I ask when I think about the book that to me emerge from reading the kind of work that I described that I was gravitating towards. So I'll do it by kind of going through my chapters. So next slide, if you don't mind. So one question and thinking about kind of different attributes or points of what a Soviet Jew is, for me, is the question of pogroms that followed the revolution. Really kind of fundamental. This question has become really important to scholars in the last 5-6 years. So it's Elisa Ben-Porat's book, but also Jeffrey Weidlinger's, Brendan McGeever's, Irina Stashkevich has a book on gender violence and so forth. So there's kind of an emerging archive of work. So I'm interested in sort of what happens to Jews from the Pale of Settlement when they end up assaulted by multiple warring armies in the midst of post-revolutionary violence. And I try to think about the Soviet Jew in this instance as a figure shaped by the trauma of pogroms of this period between 1918 and 1921, mostly in Ukraine, when tens of thousands of Jews died in violence perpetrated by multiple sides. And with every one of my questions, I have a central text to kind of guide me. And the text here is David Bergelsen's aforementioned novel, Midas Hadin, or in Harriet Murab in my translations, Judgment. There are multiple ways to translate the title. That's a whole separate talk. But kind of the points that I want to make is about this text is that it has a kind of interesting history of being ignored in the post-war period during the Cold War by Yiddishists, by Western Yiddishists, in part because of its associations with that proclamation that Bergelsen had made about wanting to become a Soviet writer. Bergelsen by then is an established author. By around 1920, he's published his 3 major novels. He is well known. He is a modernist who is compared to Chekhov and Hamsun, right? And suddenly to Western critics, later, right? Why does he write this Bolshevik novel, right? Why does he write a novel in which the main protagonist is Commissar Filipov, who is, he's not a commissar, so he's a Chekist. He's a member of the Bolshevik secret police. Why does Bergelsen write a novel that sort of admires this figure of judgment, somebody who is really unfair, unjust towards Jews in the shtetl, where he sets up camp on the border between Ukraine that the Bolsheviks are trying to hold on to around 1920 and Poland. But framing the question that way is not helpful because the text is so weird, and we can kind of establish its weirdness through this really disjointed history of serialization and other ways in which the main protagonist is really kind of a red herring. And instead, the novel devolves into a series of connected, but sort of not fully connected plots that can tell a multiplicity of different stories, right? So the story that I see is not the story of the glorious Bolshevik, because the Bolshevik protagonist of the story is sick, he has terrible wounds on his neck, and he is considered by others to be a goner, right? So he is like dying. He dies at the end of the novel, right? So instead, this novel is full of Jews who are living in the shtetl where the border outpost is near, who, because of this new border, right? If I remember my kind of border, the image of the map, have had to resort to smuggling. That's the only way in which they can exist, right? Sort of financially. And they smuggle goods, but they also smuggle people who try to get out. There's also political literature, political organization that gets smuggled. It's a political thriller. It's a kind of novel about smugglers. And to me, the important moment was that Bergelsen, who is in Berlin, starting in 1921, he lives in Berlin until 1934, is writing this novel starting in 1925, 1926, in the city, which is full of refugees from pogrom violence in Ukraine, where, moreover, there's already a very serious project of collecting testimony of survivors and witnesses of pogroms that has already been published by the mid-1920s. Collected by Shimon Dubnov, collected by other people. There's already in Russian, in Yiddish, there's an awareness, right, of what happened to those people, why they left. He knows how the story ends. But he sets this novel in 1920 before the protagonists of his novel know how the story ends. So he tries to enter this period of Jewish psyche when Jews in this border region are told to believe that the Bolsheviks are there to save them. But the Bolshevik who is there to save him is dying, right? So how do you live in this moment of anxiety that then sort of becomes this pivotal moment? So to me, that moment of trauma and anxiety is central to one of these attributes of what me being a Soviet Jew might be. Liana Hamel earlier today kind of told a different side of the same novel, how you can look at another seemingly peripheral character, a woman, right, who tells, by looking at her, with looking at a different story, and that story becomes about how Bergelsen is interested in portraying women a la Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, and what that has to do with Russian literary cultural history. So this novel is open for this kind of interpretation. Next slide. Bergelsen also writes it, right, just to make one example of the multiplicity of languages. He writes it at the time he reads Russian. He writes it at a time when there's already an established genre of literary works, which are horrible to read, but one has to suffer through such things, of literature about the Chekists, right? There's already literature in Russian about the Chekists. Some of it already published in the Soviet Union, including a novel by Ilya Ehrenburg that was published in 1923, right? So before he even begins to read, there's already a novel about Chekist protagonists. So he kind of knows how to write or he has a model of a Bolshevik novel that he won't follow, right? And then the next slide, there's also by then, right, a whole body of literature about the Civil War more broadly. Isaac Babel, we've heard one presentation about Babel today. Isaac Babel is with Cavalry, which has a Jewish protagonist. but also Alexander Faddeev's Razgrom. I mean, it comes out after Bergesen begins to write it, but it's at the same, time where the protagonist is Jewish, right? And the Jewishness doesn't really mean much, right? But it's kind of there in the discourse. So kind of paying attention to that. So that's my one question, right? And the question about the centrality of pogroms to the story of the Soviet Jew and the trauma of pogroms, the anxiety of pogroms, the violence of pogroms, the violence that isn't openly acknowledged, because in the novel, you really have to read sort of carefully to understand it, including gender violence. There's very oblique references to rape, which has now become, people have written books about this question, etc. So sort of second question for me is to think about the way in which Soviet Jew as a figure emerges in the moment of industrialization and the Stalin's kind of culture revolution. And to really think about how industrialization meant this kind of speeding up of time, meant a kind of catapulting into a new age very rapidly. It meant introduction of electricity. There was widespread radio, campaigns against illiteracy, all of these things. So I'm trying to think, with the help of Moshe Kulbach-Zelminyaner that Elaine had mentioned, about how taking a look at one family on the outskirts of a fairly provincial Soviet city at a time when it's starting to go through these rapid changes of industrialization allows Kulbach to think about how these people could become Jews in the Soviet Union, so they could become a version of the kind of new Soviet man that's the kind of intended end result of industrialization, but instead they become something else, which I call Soviet Jew, that is sort of riven by all kinds of incongruities and in disjunctures. I'll talk more about this when I give, at the end of the talk, I'll give my one example about kind of one in-depth look at something, and I'll come back to Kulbach. Sort of third question, going back to Gennadi's talk about Birobidzhan. Birobidzhan is really essential. Do you mind hitting it one more time? Yes, thank you. So Birobidzhan is a different version of the map that Gennady had for us, right? Birobidzhan is the red square in the Far East, and this is the Pale of Settlement, right? So we're thousands of kilometers from the place where Ashkenazi Jews come from. And I think about what happens to those of you who weren't at the talk that Gennady gave, right, and who are maybe hearing about Birobidzhan for the first time. This is the project that was established in 1928 to kind of define Jews in the Soviet Union by connection to territory as other sort of titular ethnic groups in the Soviet Union. So like Ukrainians in the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, Bashkirs in the Bashkir Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, etc. So Jews did not have a territory. Let's give them a territory. That territory is in the Far East, right? So what I try to think about here is how this place is really important discursively because it's so present in the discussions about Jews in the Soviet Union at the time. But at the same time, and this is what Gennady spoke about, very few Jews ever move there, right? So it's a place that fails. So why write a whole chapter about Birobidzhan when I try to think about Birobidzhan, about kind of contours of the Soviet Jew? Because so few actual Soviet Jews ever moved to that place. Well, if you don't mind going to the next slide, I try to, here I think about a couple of different texts, but I still am guided by one event. In 1929, Ikor had sent a delegation to Birobidzhan that was chaired by the president of Brigham Young University, Benjamin Harris, and it included agronomists and soil specialists, et cetera, that produced the voluminous output of reports that were published in America and also translated into Yiddish and published in Russian. But part of that delegation, and that was meant to kind of see what the Soviets were promising the Jews, right? Like what is it that was promised to kind of establish what the facts were. And they wrote the conclusion, yes, very good for beekeeping, very good for this and that. Accompanying that expedition were two writers from Odessa, Semyon Gecht and Viktor Fink, who ended up writing a lot about this expedition and Birobidzhan in the years after it took place, so between 1929 and 1936, but never moving in their narrative past the moment of that initial encounter in 1929, right? So they end up writing novels. In case of Gecht, there's a novel called The Ship Sails to Jaffa and Back about disappointment in Zionism and kind of relocation to Birobidzhan. Gecht also writes a story for children. He writes a story. He writes a play. Fink writes Jews in the Taiga in two different editions that I mentioned before. Both of them also write articles for publications like Aganyok, which is a major kind of Soviet publication. And to me, they're both looking for what cannot be found, which is Jews, right? They're there on an expedition to write about the promise of this place for Jews in the Soviet Union that the Soviet state says is a place where Soviet Jews will be defined as Jews in the Soviet Union. And instead, he finds their non-arrival. So I try to think about non-arrival as itself the definition of the figure of the Soviet Jew, right? That instead of becoming marked in alignment with this sort of ideological construction, the figure of the Soviet Jew is the figure that never arrives. Another important point for me is to think about the figure of the Soviet Jew as related to reverse migration from the West, sometimes Palestine, to the Soviet Union. And I'm talking about people who had been born in the Russian Empire in the Pale of Settlement before the Russian Revolution, had left before the revolution, and then in the early 1930s, the Great Depression in America, the promise of the socialist homeland, sometimes political convictions, sometimes interest in kind of going back to family that's still there, go to visit their kin who might still be living in Ukraine, in a shtetl, or they might have be moving to Birobidzhan, some of them. There are some stories like that, including this one spy, where the whole family moves to the nuclear spy, I forget his name now, whose whole family moves from Iowa to Birobidzhan, but they had left before the revolution, or the father did. So I try to think about, again, just as with the Birobidzhan, these are not statistically significant numbers, right? Not that many Jews do this, but those who do leave a trace in this kind of public record, including in this case for me, film, right? I try to think about Soviet film in the 1930s that picks up this topic. And film is really fascinating because this film, there's a series of films. I focus on one called The Return of Nathan Becker, that is considered to be the first Soviet Yiddish talking or Soviet, you always get confused. First Soviet Yiddish sound film. So it's the very beginning of the sound era. Very little of the Yiddish actually survives. Most of what we have is in Russian, dubbed in Russian. I mean, all film is dubbed at that time, so because that's the sound technology. But I try to think about, and this is a film based on a screenplay by Peretz Markish, who also wrote a novel later based on the film, and it's made by two co-directors, Rachel Milman and Boris Shpis, who had begun as avant-garde directors in the 1920s. I'm kind of trying to think about how the figure of the returning Jew to the Soviet Union is now kind of doubly marked in a negative way for where he's going. On the one hand, he's from the Pale of Settlement, so that's already a sort of a, old baggage, right? The sort of heaps of rags. But now he's also been compromised by capitalism, right? Because he's coming from the evil West. So the protagonist of this film was a bricklayer in New York, right? Who built skyscrapers for Rockefeller, right? And he is gung-ho about his bad capitalist methods of construction. It's a film about construction, as all Soviet films at the time are in some way. And so the literal, showdown in the film is a kind of a duel between him and a Slavic, more kind of upright looking, taller man, Northland Becker, who is in the foreground, is kind of hunched down, about who will build the bigger wall of bricks according to their method. And of course, the Soviet method wins. If you look carefully in the back of the screen, so it all sounds really funny, right? But this is a major scene of, and what is this the scene of, right? You could think about it as a scene of testing whether a Jew like this could become a Soviet person, right? Whether he could become a version of a Soviet man. You see helpfully a Soviet man in the background, painted, right? In the ideal muscular figure. The whole Bolshevik project, right, is extremely muscular, kind of a very masculinist and masculine. People have written sort of extensively about this. And there's like an attempt, right? Is he going to be like that or not, right? And instead, he becomes a Soviet Jew who sort of something else happens to his body that isn't quite what's supposed to happen. So he's not shaped up in this way. So I'm trying to think about this returning emigre as somebody who doesn't become a Jew in the Soviet Union, but instead becomes a Soviet Jew. And then the last slide, I began this talk with Isaac Babel. Isaac Babel is really key to my intellectual development, my kind of first fascination with Isaac Babel. And I come back to him in the final chapter of my book. And I try to look at this entire period, right, from right after the revolution through the 1930s with the help of Isaac Babel's work. And I try to trace the figure of the folkloric trickster, Herschel Astra, a figure from Yiddish folklore, in Isaac Babel's work. This has been, he published a very early story, 1918. He began to publish in 1915 when he was very young. He published a story about Herschel Estapoli called Shabbos Nachemu. By people who study Babel, it had sort of been dismissed as a sort of early juvenilia where he tries to be some kind of, unimportant Jewish writer. But to me, it becomes really key because Herschel Estapoli keeps popping up in the rest of his writing that touches on really pivotal moments in Soviet history that Babel lives through. So lives through the kind of deprivations that follow the revolution in Petrograd. So he sort of writes about that, and Herschel comes up there. The War of 1920, which is the war about kind of Bolshevik expansion into the West. And then the final traces of Herschel that I see is around collectivization and Babel's attempts to write about Ukraine, but being unable to do so, but kind of being able to smuggle it in through this trickster figure. So I try to ask these, in this question, right, this is about the traces of the folkloric in kind of the Pale of Settlement, Yiddish, Ashkenazi folklore, in its traces in Soviet culture, in the way that become productive, right? That Babel puts to new uses that can uncover new meanings about the Soviet experience through this particular set of eyes. So let me come back to the next slide. We'll come back to the title. So like a major, point, shortcoming, a limitation of sources, right, as what I described marks the figure of Soviet Jew as male. And I come back to this picture, right, where everybody we see is male. I'm not saying, right, that the Soviet Jew was a man or that there were no Soviet Jews who were women. What I'm saying is that we need to be, when we look at these kinds of sources, right, sort of published, well circulating, that elicited discussion, we end up with this kind of figure. And I'm putting it up front, right? This is I call attention to this in the introduction, that we end up kind of thinking about the masculinity of the Bolshevik project and its implications for thinking about Soviet Jews, but also in Jewish history, right, that going back to European enlightenments in European countries of how the figure of the Jew in the Austro-Hungarian Empire or in the Prussian Empire or in France, right, is also understood as a man because things like army service or eligibility for capability for army service come up in those discussions about citizenship, right? So that's kind of, I draw attention to this point in part also to invite other, there are other texts to write about, right? Other approaches to think about how we might try to tell the story. And I also write about women in this book. I write about gender violence, but women are written about from the point of view of male authors. So the big question there is, right, how to tell a version of the story with different kinds of literary sources, maybe cinematic sources that I'm not able to get to because of how I've set up my my approach. And then to kind of next slide, right? And I'm kind of trying to fix this now through this new translation project with Harriet Mirav, where when you look at the post-war period, there's so many writers for women, right? This is a completely different scene. Also, again, we're doing the same thing as I did with my book. We're doing it in our translation. We're writing about authors who were published in the Soviet Union, right? So trying to kind of translate these authors. And along the lines, I'm beginning to write what might be maybe a sequel to the book, right? By kind of, again, translating these new works, trying to think about something like How the Soviet Jew Was Made Part 2, right? Looking at the post-war period where there's a very different notion of who writes, what they say, and the way the gender plays could be kind of publicly traced to play a certain role. So let me skip over the next 2 seconds and just do the last 5 minutes. I'm going to skip this. Okay, I'll give one example, and this is since this is Elaine's, the text that we have in common, I figured I will do this. Trying to tell you kind of a specific example so that it's not so kind of highfalutin and hypothetical of how I try to put all of this together in a story that I'm seeing here. So this is the question of industrialization, right? And this kind of the Stalin modernity, Soviet modernity. And the help for me in this is Moshe Kulbak and his novel Zelmenyaner. Zelmenyaner is a name that's difficult to pronounce. It's their progeny of a man named Zalman, right? So Zelmenyaner is kind of like a last name, but it's not, but they're children of Zalman or Zelmele. People often cannot pronounce this name, but I teach people. When to me, so I edited a translation of this novel. The translation was done by Hillel Halkin. And again, when you do editing and translation, if you translate, you notice all these things. So something jumped out at me. Next slide, if you don't mind, that really caught my attention and gave me sort of chills down the spine, goosebumps. At some point, right, Soviet modernity and all, there's a family in this novel. It's a very large clan. It's like Sholem Aleichem times 4 at least, possibly more, depends on how you count, because there are multiple kind of figures who are older, warring with their children and sometimes grandchildren over questions of ideology and life and whatever. But all of them go to the movies at some point, right? This is Minsk. They go to the movies. They live on the outskirts of town in a hoif, which is a courtyard, dvor in Russian, kind of a place where they all are. That's really far out, not really in the city. But one day they hear a ringing of the bell of the tram near their courtyard, and that is how they get to the movies. So they go to the movies, and we don't know what they see. We don't have the title, but we have a description through the eyes of somebody in the older generation who then wants to go to the movies again, but his wife won't let him because she thinks people are going to steal things from him. So he had to be content, Uncle Icha, he was a tailor, had to be content with reviewing in his mind all the ocean waters and white polar bears that had appeared before him that magical evening in the cinema. At night, stitching a pair of quilted pants, he thought with an aching heart about white bears and frozen travelers on icebergs, people for whom such pants would be just the thing. So I was really struck by this when this came along. It could be nothing, right? It could be just something that Kulbak invented. It's a novel, but it sort of nagged at me that like this might be an actual film that they saw. And so I had a hypothesis at this point of what it was. Some of you who are film buffs probably have a hypothesis at this point too. But I went about trying to find the context for this. And here's how I kind of came to think about this. So first, next slide, if you don't mind. I mentioned that this novel was serialized, and I mentioned that serialization is really important to me as an approach. So this is the table of contents for Stern, a monthly published in Minsk. This is the December 1929 issue. The second item in the table of contents is the first chapter of the book Zelmenyaner, right? So that's what Die Mishpocha Zelmenyaner, it's called differently when it comes out as a book. Facing it, right, is recognizable portrait of Stalin. Why is there a portrait of Stalin? This is Stalin's 50th birthday, right? So this is the congratulations to Soviet Stalin, written in block letter, in darker, right, font, from the editorial board of Stern. So this, to me, is immediately, okay, we're reading a novel, but are we reading only a novel, right? We're reading something besides just a literary text, and it's really important to try to get into its kind of lived reality, so to speak. Next slide, if you don't mind. This is, so Roy had showed us this image earlier, right? So this novel is set in Minsk, which is also where Kulbak lives. He came there in 1926 from Vilna, where he had lived for some years before, and before then he was in Berlin, and his parents ended up in Minsk during the First World War. He was from Smarhoin, which is 4 hours or so from Minsk in the kind of Lithuanian, Belarusian borderlands. And Minsk is a really fascinating place at this time because it's the capital of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. And at the time, the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic has 4 official languages, which are Belarusian, Polish, Russian, and Yiddish, right? So this is the state seal of Soviet Belarusia. In these years, the exotic years, or the years of that map, however we refer to them, interwar years, though that's not the term that Elaine prefers, and it's not as crucial. But when Yiddish is an official language, right, of a constitutive republic of the Soviet Union. So it's a place where we can think about life, official life of various kinds unfolding in Yiddish, and also institutions of learning that exist in Yiddish, right? So there's scientific institutes, publications, right? The kind of literary sphere, but also kind of a vast array of public life in this very kind of Jewish city that happens in Yiddish. So that's really important. So what kind of place is Minsk at this point, right? So this is 1929 is when I know that the novel began to be serialized. When I was in Minsk once kind of doing this research, probably never be able to go back again, which I guess is kind of sad. But I decided that I would read the daily press and just kind of see, to get a feel for it, right? So this is from 1929, and I know that the novel begins in first chapter is published December, so I figure preceding months are just as important. So this is, you know, like what you might see in paper in Minsk, in the Rabochi, in the worker, right? Somebody's cow had walked out, and they placed an ad looking for the cow, right? So that's small place, right? On the other hand, right, it's a place that is obsessed with its new tram. New electric trolley, right? So papers, this is the same month, right, as the cow ad, right? They're like daily articles about this like upcoming, you know, launch of the tram, like really obsessed. So it's a small town that's really proud of getting its electric trolley, right? So these two things are side by side. And if you remember, right, in the next slide, Zelmenyaner, this family, fictional family from a novel, goes to the movies by tram, right? And they're able to go to the movies because the tram now can take them to the movies. This is what very helpfully the guy who runs the tram project in Minsk writes in his editorial on the day that the tram launches, right? Which is October 14th, 1929, says great benefit for the residents of Akrayan, right? Of this far-flung district, which is exactly where Zelmenyaner lived. Right, so I'm now beginning to get a sense that, okay, they're fictional protagonists, but I can map them over onto the context of Minsk in these years. So this is a picture from a couple of years later, and this is in my book. I really like this image. There are only a couple of movie theaters in Minsk at the time. This is Red Dawn, and you can see the rail the tracks in front of it, right? So I want to find this image of the movies and the tram. So back to the question, right? So I'm putting these things together. Serialization gives me a sense of when to look for other things that are contextual to try to understand this as a novel that also has a life at the time. So then I'm, okay, let's read the movie chronicle, right? Because they published the movie chronicle in the same newspaper. So I read the movie chronicle and then my eyes pop, and because this confirms what I suspected, but I came to it through this kind of detective work. Before I translate this, for those of you who don't read Russian, this is really interesting, right? Because just above, so the big square with different little squares is movie announcements, with the square just above it is a theater announcement for David Bergelson's Der Täuber in the Yiddish theater, right? So we have kind of also really interesting to kind of think about the side by side. But I'm looking at the square second from the bottom, and the next slide gives you the translation, right? So in October of 1929, the week that the tram began to run in Minsk, they were showing Nanook of the North. How many people know the film? Some people, okay, look up the film, right? It's like a film for film buffs to know. It's a film from 1922 that was made by Robert Flaherty, who was a Harvard ethnographer, anthropologist. It's widely available. You're not going to have trouble finding it. It had been considered for a long time by people who didn't know better or believed Flaherty's claims to be a first documentary ever made. Not true, right? This is not the case. There are many other documentaries. And moreover, people who have studied the film since, and this is really important for I'll come back to how this all connects to Zilminyaner in a minute, but people who've studied the film have thought about this film since as not a documentary. So Flaherty goes beyond the Arctic Circle to film the Inuit, right? And he calls it a documentary, right? But to make the film that he makes the people that he interacts with, it's unethical practices of what we now understand to be unethical practices, this white man coming in and telling people what to do. He makes them act in ways in which they no longer live, right? So he makes them reenact their quote unquote native, quote unquote authentic practices in ways that they no longer practice because modernity, whatever that means, including Robert Flaherty's own arrival, has meant a change to their lives, right? So the most famous example is that the protagonist of the film hunts seals with a harpoon, but he, in real life, was using like a rifle at that point, right? So he wasn't doing what Flaherty has him do in film. So people who study this film refer to this film and also a similar move by other ethnographers as salvage ethnography, right? So something that you know as a Western observer is a culture that is disappearing. You want to document it as though it was still alive, and you make a case that it's still there, right? So you kind of salvage these bits. What does that mean? We can go to the next slide. This is just a review in the press, but this is not important. Let me kind of come back and wrap this up and finish, right? So I mentioned that they live on the outskirts of Minsk. They lived in a place that in the novels referred to as a hoif, that in its description is very reminiscent of the kind of a stereotypical shtetl being described, including their interactions with non-Jewish neighbors and other things. In shtetl, this is Minsk, 1929, is very important to social scientists. And Moshe Kulbak, the writer of this novel, has a day job in Minsk at the time, and his day job is to work as a stil redaktor, a stylistic editor, at the Belarusian Academy of Sciences, which has a Jewish section or Jewish department. So then I was sort of interested in what the Jewish department publishes, and they're interested in publishing these kind of ethnographic studies driven by kind of Soviet era ideological approaches of studying Jews, former shtetl Jews, right? Jews in the shtetls that are still there, that is now part of the Soviet Union. They're trying to study them and try to study their folkways and whatnot, but it has a goal, right? The goal is to study them, to understand how to turn them into Soviet people, right? So there's an idea about what Soviet Jews should be, right? And Moshe Kulbak, the poet, the novelist, knows that literature because he is editing it, right, for these publications. And at the same time, writing this satirical comic novel where he turns the whole project on its head, right? So this move to Nanook and to salvage ethnography is highlighting his awareness, right, of what he is engaged with in describing, and that instead his novel describes not what Soviet Jews should become according to Soviet ideology, but what they are becoming, which is incoherent, right? There is not like a coherence to what they are. It's a jumble of all different things. So instead of describing Jews becoming Soviet, he describes people becoming versions of the Soviet Jew. Okay, I think I'll end. This is long enough, and I hope that we have time for questions.
So thank you so much for this wonderful talk. If you have not yet read his book, please do. We're going to open it up to questions, though I'm going to be indulgent once more and ask you, no one has yet mentioned Bakhtin, and this is partially a Slavic conference, so someone's got to do it. But I am really taken with actually the chapter you have on the return of Nathan Becker. And then you also do mention Cirque, the film Circus, as well, which I think is a really pivotal film for this moment. And because you have this concept of non-arrival that I think is not just in the chapter on Birobidzhan, but is in many ways, I think, kind of the defining feature of the Soviet Jew throughout the text. I want to take us back to that circus space, which is both the arena in which the brick building competition takes place, as well as where we have another like sort of pivotal socialist realist film, Cirque, which is about the circus. And that is a film in which we have race relations and the friendship of peoples coming together. And then within Nelson Becker, we've got suddenly the sort of fashioning, the creation of this, the rehabilitation, if you will, of the Jewish figure into the new Soviet man. And so to take this concept of the circus, which in a way invites discussion of carnival, or a space where the impossible becomes feasible, I want to ask you, because it is that sort of playful upside down space, is this the only time that we have an actual arrival? Because it is by its very nature liminal, and also a place where all things are permissible. It's a big question, but it's the one instance where we have, I think, the kind of fairy tale utopian messianic conclusion. In Cirque, or even in Nelson Becker, the implication of both the concretization of the Soviet Jew or the rehabilitation of the capitalist into the Soviet Jew.
Thank you. I have to think about this. I mean, Bakhtin is also, there's unfinalism. I can't say this word. Things that can become final, right? They're always open. They're sort of, so I'm very partial to this, obviously. But to think about whether it's interesting, right? So this film, right, the Nelson Becker, it is strange, right? That a socialist construction competition that involves laying bricks would not be part of building, let's say, a factory wall. And I think it is in the novel that Peretz Markish writes a few years later. But in this film, it's in the circus. This makes no sense. Why would you build, and they're there for hours, right? What do you do with this afterwards? It is a concretization, but of what, right? I don't know, right? It's a spectacle, right? Because it turns productive labor that this is supposed to model, because that's what this is about, right? The premise of the competition, who can be a better bricklayer. Why turn a moment that could be an opportunity for productive construction into something that is a spectacle? Is that itself the point? I think that's a really, I don't know, but that's a great, I think in your question is, I don't know if there's another moment quite like this, right? To think about how, and this is what's even more remarkable, right? Is that this then this vision, right, if this is what this is supposed to mean, is then exported, right? Because this film plays, you can find reviews of it in the American press, right? It plays in America, including as a propaganda picture for people who are supposed to move to the Soviet Union, who are somehow supposed to take this vision of arrival and not be disturbed by the spectacle of bricks in the circus. I don't know, right? But it's a great. I think your question really has the answer, right? And I think it's very provocative. So thank you.
Time for a few questions. Noah. So you're talking about the metaphorical non-arrival in Birobidzhan, where representation that center the Soviet Jew failed to portray what is actually there, right? They failed to portray reality. And if I zoom out, you draw on film and fiction and nonfiction, and you show how the metaphorical non-arrival is constructed essentially through socialist realism, right? Disproportional focus on the future and suppression of the present. And in that sense, I'm thinking about the metaphorical non-arrival as part of the grander achievement of Stalinism, the way Boris Groys points it out, which is a quintessential artistic project, right? It was a project of the imagination, most of anything, right? Most of it. So this brings me to my question. What do you perceive, or how do you perceive Jewish visual or plastic art, not only from that period, but also with the same subject matter of the colonies in Crimea, southern Ukraine, or the Jewish autonomous region? For instance, I think that in the Eco expedition, alongside Fink and Gach, there were also visual artists. So how do you read their work? Do you know? Are you aware of their work? How do you read it as such, and how do you read it in the larger context of artistic production?
Thank you, Noah. So I don't know how to write about art. Like this is, and it's one of my limitations, right? I write about what I know how to write about. So I know the visual record, and it pops up also alongside, newspaper publications, etc. Right? So I just don't know how to read it. So, but you do. So, last night I watched an excellent talk by you about Issachar Ben Ribak, and kind of thinking about the sort of one item from the old world that's dragged into the new and left right in the middle of it, which I found really compelling. So I don't know if there is something similar going on, but in as far as plastic arts can help concretize visually things that are not narrative, and also this is part of Elaine's question, right? That brick wall in the circus is very concrete, right? It's sort of become, right? It's sort of, there's something there, right? Yeah, but there's something more concrete maybe to the visualization of what, to me, I'm mostly concerned with narrative, right? So kind of the narrative imagination that makes things sort of imagined and not concrete. And, the Birobidzhan text drawn, the fact that it's just impossible to to stare into the Birobidzhan, but oops, it's nighttime, we can't describe what we see because we can't see anything. There's all these excuses. But when you have to draw, right, I guess you have to, or I mean, also films, right? There's the Seekers of Happiness, which is a fiction film, but it's interspersed with all of these tableaus that are very long. There's like a minute here, a minute there, which are just kind of, scenery that has no narrative purpose, right? But it's clearly there for some kind of visual documentation, right? That has nothing to do with the imagined story. Or the film about the collective farms in Crimea that Mayakovsky was involved with, right? I'm forgetting the name, but right, sort of that visual evidence is there. I'm just not very good at knowing what to do with it. So I'm looking forward to your work.
Thank you so much for this talk. I really appreciate all the care you put into outlining your methodology, and I thought it was fascinating. the cultural historical elements. My question is about the role of like center and periphery in your work. So if I'm interpreting the maps that we saw correctly, it seems like just in a very literal sense, even let alone a metaphorical one, like the Pale of Settlement and also Birobidzhan were the periphery, right? And then you're also invoking like the role of anthropology and ethnography, whether it's, Jewish social scientists studying the kind of transformation of Jews or not transformation from the shtetl into this kind of Soviet identity. But we can also think of like the deep history even further, like Shai Ansky's like ethnographic expedition. And also I'm just thinking about like contemporary works like Sam Spinner's Jewish primitivism. So I'm just wondering, like, both in a Jewish context, but also like the example with the person visiting the Inuit population in the Arctic, like where is the role of center and periphery, and then also like the quote unquote primitive, and how is that used to kind of construct a difference?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So there are other things on the map, if you look kind of more closely, that, kind of channels the other things that are present by not being described too closely, right? So Palestine is there, right? In contrast to Birobidzhan, because that's how it comes up in Birobidzhan texts, as Birobidzhan becomes the center of where Jews in the Soviet Union are supposed to be. This is where Jews are supposed to live, but a contrast is drawn, including in literary texts, to Palestine, right? To the Zionist project. The novel that's central to what I write about is a ship sails to Jaffa and back, right? So the novel spends a lot of time in Palestine, which is peripheral, right? So if you think about routes of migration back to the Soviet Union, right, you have the sea routes, right? Something happens off screen, so to speak. We have the beginning of that voyage at the start of the beginning of the film Nos and Becker. We have the first scene is in New York Harbor as he's sailing away, right? So that is periphery, right? So I don't know geographically if we can think about any one place as center. I think it's the Soviet project, right, that becomes itself the center of where things are, and it might have different locations, right? So I think that to me is, I wasn't so kind of drawn to thinking about sort of representability of where Jews live, for example, right? So in terms of the kind of repeating other, Ansky, these other pre-revolutionary expedition, but also kind of wartime, First World War, sort of around another moment of destruction and Churban Galitze, and I think Ansky operates much more with the center in mind, right? Because he's very much a sort of part of the Jewish, part of intelligentsia, right? Whose projects are based in capital cities, and it's about bringing that peripheral culture into the center, right? And something like the Dibuk, which of course Agi is an expert on, right? If you think about this as the right paradigmatic, modern Jewish play, right, constructed out of some kind of performance of, a periphery, very much for the benefit of something like metropolitan culture, whether that's Petrograd, right, or Tel Aviv, right? It sort of stays that way, or in other iterations too. Which actually brings me to one thing that I forgot to mention in the methodology, and this kind of goes to Ansky. The Ansky question reminds me, is to think about how to, if you're talking about cultural center, cultural periphery, right? How to deal with trying to reconstruct or try to think about like a typology of a cultural figure who isn't necessarily a member of intelligentsia, but through texts, right, that are written by people who are, right, because Kulbach and Bergelsen and Bible, right? So we're talking about, I'm not studying texts that are by proletarian workers. And that's, I think partially where that tension is, right? How they make these moves, Kuhlbach and Bergelsen in particular, but also Babel and others, to try to, right, understand some kind of a prototypical person who could be close to a, просто Yid, which they themselves are not. So that also has to do, I guess, with center and periphery.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. And I've been trying to think about how to put these thoughts into a coherent question, but I'm interested in the sort of conflict between bricks and wood, and thinking back to Professor Estreich's talk about there not being any sewage in the shtetl, and that's how you differentiate it. There's also not many bricks when you think about the wooden architecture, and how this sort of conflict plays into the movie, and specifically the scene in Nossenbecker Fort de Heim with the bricklaying competition as something that's training, I guess, the new Jew to leave the shtetl, but the fact that it's also a movie and being put out for viewing audiences, there's no movie theaters in the shtetl either. To what extent, I don't know, the entire talkie itself really accomplishes its intent versus Marcus's novel that comes out years later, which would be able to reach the shtetl and have this sort of new exotic impact on the Jewish readership in this primarily wooden locale, if that makes sense.
But then, places that where the shtetl become the city and get a movie theater, right? Zelminyaner. So it's not necessarily, right, that people don't see I don't know, right, how to study. I mean, there's a way to study distribution in the Soviet system, but there's like a different way of looking at the archival record. But right, the question about bricks and wood is really important, right? Why do this, right? Especially given the story that Gennady told, right? If there's no sewers in Azerbaijan, that's supposed to be the homeland for Soviet Jews, why waste the effort building bricks on, in a circus arena? It's incongruous, right? So like, I mean, and this goes back also to Noah's question, right? The kind of the central aspect of socialist realism, and in various ways, all of the things that I deal with have to negotiate that as a either established aesthetic or an emerging kind of literary, cinematic aesthetic, about how all of this becomes about a vision of something that can't possibly exist. Because socialist religion, socialist realism imagines things, right, that never are messianic, right? There can't be achieved. It's all about the vision of something that is in the future, but you're supposed to present it as concrete. And maybe bricks on stage is precisely, back to your question, I'm now thinking about this more, is a fantastic example of socialist realism, right? Because it is the socialist future in its, oh God, I always mess this up, in its development, socialist reality, in its, what am I missing? In its, how does this go? The famous phrase by Gorky, socialist realism is, I'm blanking. All of us know this, but trying to represent something in its, that doesn't exist yet as though it existed, right? So bricks representing something that should be a factory, but a factory that isn't actually built is a perfect encapsulation of the in its revolutionary development. There we go. Socialist reality in its revolutionary development. There we go. Right, so something that can't exist. So I don't know. So I think that becomes the sort of, everything is like this. The question becomes then, what do you do with this, right? What do we do with this whole Soviet Jew, right? Why map this out if all of this imagines things that don't exist? And I think that that question is for later, right? Because we want to, there is a part 2 and part 3 and whatever, how something like this does become concretized in the way that people relate in later periods to this kind of post-revolutionary moment. but it itself sort of doesn't come to be, as it were.
So I say first. We have enough.
Out of Soviet Union to Israel, or to later to Israel and also to Italy, John, do you see a counter wave? Because I was just in Portugal in June and July, and I was surprised that Israelis are going to Portugal, supposedly because they need to breathe. That was the article. And secondly, that they wanted land around them, more space. So some are going to northern Portugal in semi-rural areas, and in fact becoming farmers. There are others that already have jobs, and they can work long distance through the computer. And I'm just wondering if you see a possibility at all of Israelis going to, let's say, going back to Ukraine, or going to Ukraine for the first time, and also to Russia, let's say in 10 years from now. Is that a possibility or not? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. I think we have maybe time for one more question after this, and then we should clear out of the short space.
There's Benjamin, I think. Yeah. So I think your question is about today, if I understood it correctly. A future. Versteht sich. Right. I was going to say I don't have the crystal ball. I mean, it's a different question about geopolitics, right? Like, I don't know what's going to happen to Russia. Hopefully, it will fall apart into, defederate into smaller regions that will not have imperial ambitions, right? That would be nice. So I don't know if there are any Jews living elsewhere, including, former Soviet Jews living in Israel, right? I don't know how they will relate to this, hopefully, right, new entity that will not be able to colonize its neighbors. Ukraine is, a different story, right? I hope that Ukraine kicks Russia out and is able to sustain itself as an independent state, which was already very vibrantly inscribed in kind of global Jewish life, with people moving back and forth. So I don't know. I don't know if there's a similar move.
Thanks so much for the talk and covering kind of a massive amount of ground in such a short amount of time. But I have a question just following up on this center periphery issue. And in a way, it's an unfair question. So I'll preface it by saying that. But I'm wondering where, so you're talking about the Soviet Jew, but I'm wondering where these Jews that very much sit on the periphery of the Jews that you're talking about lie in relation to your project. So Jews in Central Asia and the Caucasus that are very much engaged with the Yevsektia, and the Yevsektia is trying to define who they are, and how they're kind of made into the Soviet Jew and exist alongside this kind of Yiddish-Russian axis.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very important question, right? That's another, in various ways in which I outline methodologically, what I'm looking at, right, is also what I'm not looking at because of how I set the, so I'm interested in Ashkenazi Jews, right? And I'm interested in the Pale and the kind of continuity with the Pale, right? So that limits me, but that's what I know, right? Somebody with a different set of skills, right, can, people are doing this research. Question for me would be, the sources would also be different, right? So if we're talking about the sort of Pale of settlement in Yiddish, there's a kind of a continuity with the literary tradition, blah, 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 right? The sources are different or in some cases, right? For Central Asia or for the Caucasus, would be a more emphasis on material culture, right? On ethnography, in some cases that had been collected, in some cases, which is in the process of being collected now by newer scholars. So I think it's a different body of material that all I can do, right, and I do it in the introduction, is acknowledge that there are other Jews who became part of the Soviet Union who are not part of the story. But that kind of goes back to the question about how once you kind of open up the conversation, right, there are ways to tell other narratives, right? This is not meant to be the narrative, right? I try to kind of decenter various other existing narratives to try to open up the field to these new interventions, but then there's space for, and a lot of this is also going to be, Bukharan Jewish culture, right, is so much of it in the last couple of decades is exilic, right? It's, New York based very heavily, right? There are people who write about it, but they're also writing about it in English, right? So there's just a very different set of questions potentially about how to even approach it. So thank you. It's great to be grilled and also talk about a book that's published, right? I can't change it, right? So all I can do is to encourage all the other projects that other people will do.
Thank you so much. We're gonna keep this super brief because we do need to start taking down everything we've set up for today, but just wanted to conclude by saying that it is with so much gratitude that Noah and I close this conference and its proceedings, and it's been an immense pleasure and honor to have spent this day in conversation with a collective of really stimulating, brilliant, generous minds. And as we close out this conference, it's also essential that we reiterate our gratitude for the many people without whom it would never have been possible. And it's a long list. I'll go fast. Are, of course, established scholars, Gennady Estreich, Elisa Bemperad, Sasha Senderovich, our roundtable participants, Leana Hamill, Roy Ginsberg, Veronique Mikish, Ilya Uchitsil, Spencer Small, and Benjamin Arenstein. And especially those behind the scenes, if they're still here on your way out, please give a massive thank you to people whose tireless efforts and laudable patience have succeeded in pulling everything together. We are so grateful to all of these people who deserve a ticker tape parade. Alla Rachkov, Eileen Hune of the Harriman Institute, Rebecca Coburn, and the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies, Professor Ofer Dines, the Columbia Slavic Department and the Germanic Department, and of course, Deutsches Haus. So thank you so much for being with us today, and another big round of applause for all